The earliest vertebrates had neither backbones nor jaws. The hagfish, or the basal group of vertebrates, this is the clade that branches off at the very base of the vertebrate family tree, and they retain those simplesiomorphic characters today. They breathe using gills, so the pharyngeal slits have been modified somewhat into gills, but they still have the notochord as their major skeletal structure. While they don't have teeth, true teeth or jaws, they do have these kind of rasping teeth on their tongue that they use to tear away chunks of dead matter from, say, the dead fish that they typically scavenge on. Lampreys are a second group of jawless, quote unquote, fishes. And they're perhaps especially interesting in the larval stage of the lamprey is a filter feeder that looks much like a sea lancelet. They live in sort of sand or rocky bottoms of streams or rivers and filter out food until at some point they grow large enough to undergo metamorphosis and become a free swimming form that lives as an ectoparasite. As adults, lampreys have an oral disc that is a very strong suction cup. And within it are keratinized teeth that the lamprey can use to rasp away flesh from its unfortunate victim. In case you were planning on sleeping tonight, this is what that mouth looks like. I imagine that you don't want to dream about having that disc attached to your flesh rasping away at you, but too late now that I've put the idea in your head. Fortunately for us, lampreys mostly like to glom onto and feed off of fish. They can be really problematic for fisheries, though. Often they don't kill the fish outright, but they do leave these very nasty wounds, and those can become infected and kill the fish, ultimately, even though the lamprey wasn't immediately responsible for its death. Those were the only kinds of fishes that were in the ocean until about 450 million years ago. This is the time at which the ostracoderms began to dominate, or came to dominate, the oceans. You may remember when we talked about evolutionary history that the ostracoderms are called the shelled fish because they were armored with this bony plating on the outsides of their bodies. There are a number of real evolutionary advances that are seen in these organisms that allowed fishes, as we know them today, to begin to take on the lifestyle that they have now. The bony armor was an important adaptation in the ostracoderms, although in that group it was incredibly heavy. Eventually that evolved to become the scales that we see on fish today, a much more flexible, lighter coat that nonetheless provides a lot of protection to the animal. Paired fins are an adaptation that you don't really think of as maybe being all that important, but without them, a swimming animal just sort of wallows from side to side. It tends to flop over from one side to another, and it can't really swim in the open water. It's restricted to moving basically along the bottom of the ocean or the bottom of the lake or stream that it's in. Once you've got paired fins, though, an animal can maintain its position, it can maintain upright while it is swimming, and this allows it to move in a much more agile fashion through the open water. Once the gills were freed entirely from the job of filter feeding and dedicated to ventilation, this also supports a much more active lifestyle because these animals are able to take in more oxygen. And finally, there's one more innovation that really allowed the feeding of these organisms to evolve. Gill arches are these rigid structures, they could be cartilage or bone, that evolved to hold the gills open while the animal was breathing. One of the problems is when you have a large animal that is trying to breathe through gills, those gill openings have a tendency to collapse. And of course, that impedes the water flow that's going through them, and that impedes your ability to get oxygen out of the water. What happened was that these rigid struts evolved that kept those gill openings wide open for ventilation purposes. But then, as is so often the case in evolution, those innovations got repurposed for a completely different function. And this is the theme that you want to keep in mind whenever you think about evolution, but we're going to see it again and again in the vertebrates, is that very often a novel evolutionary trait will simply be a repurposing of an existing trait for a novel function. Evolution tends to tinker with what is already there. And so frequently when it comes up with something new, what it's actually doing is just making something new out of something old. In this case, the something new that came along was jaws. The first two pairs of gill arches in the ancient ancestors of fishes migrated forward and became armed with teeth. Now the mouth could not only be used as a clamp or a sucker, the animal could not just rasp on its food, but it could bite it. And jaws, of course, became a very important feature of some of the organisms that we know and love today, like sharks. The cartilaginous fishes, which includes the sharks, skates, and rays, is the next group that branched off of the vertebrate family tree. Their ancestors actually had a bony skeleton, but they have secondarily reverted to having a skeleton that's entirely made of cartilage. The reason is that cartilage is less dense than bone. There are a number of different adaptations in the cartilaginous fishes that help keep them from sinking. They are heavier than water, and so they do have a tendency to sink unless they're actively swimming. Some of these animals also have internal pockets with lots of oil in them, because oil is less dense than water as well. This brings us eventually to the bony fishes. The bony fishes are the sister group, the bony fishes are part of the sister group to the cartilaginous fishes. And they've been a tremendously successful group of organisms. They start out with a cartilaginous skeleton, but then bone, rigid bone, replaces the cartilage as the fish matures. They do not have the same problem with sinking as the cartilaginous fishes do. And the reason is that most of them have a structure called a swim bladder. This started out as a very simple pouch off of the esophagus, but it became elaborated to a really quite a large structure in many of the fishes. In a lot of fishes, it became completely detached from the digestive system, so it's just a separate pocket within the body. But this pocket was used to store gas that was much less dense than water, and that allows the bony fishes to stay buoyant in water despite the fact their skeletons are so heavy. From our perspective, the most interesting thing about the swim bladder is that in some of the fishes, it evolved to take on another function, a novel function, that of extracting oxygen from the gas inside the swim bladder and putting carbon dioxide into that gas. In other words, the swim bladder became a very simple primitive lung. The lungs that you and I have are derived from the swim bladder of very ancient fishes. The tetrapods are the amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Reptiles do include birds. And the bony skeleton and these swim bladder or lungs are all synapomorphies that are shared between the bony fishes and all of the land animals that you know and love, the tetrapods. The bony fishes are a remarkable success story in their own right. There is a tremendous variety of form and function within this group, from very fast swimming ocean fishes to extraordinary camouflage of things like the pipefish and the leafy sea dragon. They have been an incredibly successful group, and they probably don't get enough credit for the remarkable diversity that they have evolved into. Yeah, this is a fish too, I know. It doesn't look like it. Most vertebrates, in fact, are members of the ray-finned fishes. That's the class Actinopterygii. There are two classes within the bony fishes. The Actinopterygii is actually a clade. The Sarcopterygii is not. The Sarcopterygii are the lobe-finned fishes, and they are not actually a clade unless you include the tetrapods within them. Because the tetrapods, the earliest amphibians and their descendants, are closely related to and derived from an even more ancient lobe-finned fish. As I mentioned before, the bony fishes have the advantage of having a light, flexible coat of scales. It's protective, but they are able to move quite rapidly. They have evolved more than just paired fins. They've evolved multiple pairs of paired fins, as well as the dorsal fin along the back, and the tail fins, and all of these allow them to move with great speed and precision. One thing that I encourage you to do next time you are at, say, a pet store is watch how different fishes use their fins to maneuver in the water. Different types of fishes will use very different motions to accomplish the same movements, and they can maneuver really beautifully in 3 dimensions, kind of moving in forward, backward, sideways, using their fins in very different ways. They have diversified into a tremendously broad range of ecological niches. With respect to most of the fishes that we see today, most of them actually have 2 pairs of jaws, one on the outside, the one that you actually see called the oral jaws, and then another pair of jaws back in the throat, the pharyngeal jaws. The neat thing about having 2 pairs of jaws is that they can play distinct roles, and it allows the fishes to feed in an almost infinite variety of different ways. They can handle all kinds of different food. In the bony fishes, the circulatory system is a single circuit. You have a heart that has 2 chambers. What that heart does is it pumps the blood at relatively high pressure out to the gills. At the gills, that blood picks up oxygen, of course, and then travels to the body without passing back through the heart again. In the body, the oxygen is dropped off, carbon dioxide is picked up, and the blood passes back through the heart on its way toward the gills again.